He thought it was just a quick stop for the night, but the motel had other plans. What if the place you checked into never wanted you to leave? Stay with me, because this true horror story will make you think twice before booking your next stay. Jake Lawson had always been a driven man, 32 years old, with a career that required constant travel. As a traveling salesman, he had seen every corner of the country, from the bustling streets of New York City to the quiet corners of rural America. But tonight was different. He had been on the road for hours, driving down an empty stretch of road through the desolate heart of Missouri. The gas gauge was running low, and there was no sign of any nearby towns. The monotony of the road, combined with the loneliness of the surrounding landscape, had started to take its toll. Jake's tired eyes had trouble focusing on the road ahead. He could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His body ached from hours of sitting, his mind numb from the isolation. The hum of the engine seemed to echo in his skull, growing louder with each passing mile. It wasn't just the physical fatigue, it was the mental strain that wore him down. The long hours without another vehicle in sight had started to make him uneasy. He had grown so used to the noise and activity of city life that the absolute silence of the road now seemed unnatural, like something was lurking just out of view. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten much since breakfast, but it was the thought of a warm bed that truly tempted him. Just the idea of climbing into a comfortable bed, washing away the grime of the road, and falling into a deep sleep felt like a distant dream. His eyelids drooped, and he instinctively turned up the volume on the radio, hoping the music would keep him alert. But the quiet stillness of the night outside was overpowering. The only thing he could hear was the monotonous drone of the tires against the asphalt, like a constant whisper urging him to keep going. His thoughts wandered. Maybe he should pull over and rest for a bit. But he didn't want to waste time. He had a deadline to meet, and the thought of missing it only made him more anxious. He had to push on. As he drove, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the headlights barely making a dent in the dark abyss that surrounded him. No streetlights, no signs of life, just him, the car, and the unyielding road ahead. He glanced at his phone. No service. Of course, the last few miles had been in a dead zone, the map on his phone now frozen. It was the kind of situation he hated, the feeling of being completely disconnected, isolated from the rest of the world. And then, just as Jake was beginning to lose hope, he saw it. Off in the distance, barely visible in the faint glow of his headlights, was a sign. The shape of it was vague, but it seemed to be pointing toward a building. He squinted, his tired eyes trying to make sense of it, and then he saw the flicker of neon lights. A motel, perhaps? The words on the sign were too faint to read, but there was no mistaking it. Place to stop. Jake's heart lifted in relief. It was exactly what he needed. His fingers tightened around the wheel as he made the decision. The road was empty, the town far behind him. The idea of a warm bed, even if it was in a rundown place, was just too tempting to pass up. He would stop for the night. Tomorrow, he could continue his journey refreshed and ready to tackle the next part of his trip. He accelerated, aiming toward the motel, his eyes fixed on the dimly lit sign in the distance. As he got closer, the outline of the building became clearer. A small, lonely structure standing alone in the middle of nowhere. The motel appeared to be stuck in time, its design old-fashioned and faded, with the flickering neon lights casting an eerie glow. But it was open, and Jake was desperate. A small, run-down motel on the side of a deserted highway was his only option. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching under the weight of the car. The place looked almost abandoned, the parking lot nearly empty, with only one other car parked in the far corner. Jake parked near the entrance and got out, stretching his legs. The air was cool and damp, and the crickets were the only noise in the stillness. A sudden chill ran down his spine, but he shrugged it off. He was just tired, nothing more. He made his way to the front door, which creaked on its hinges as he pushed it open. Inside, the small lobby was dimly lit, with old wood paneling and a musty smell in the air. The flickering neon light from outside reflected on the dusty floors. A single desk stood in the corner, and behind it sat an elderly man, his face hidden in shadow. He was still as a statue, his eyes fixed on Jake as he approached. "Good evening," Jake said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. The man didn't answer at first. His movements were slow, deliberate. He looked Jake up and down, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke in a raspy, almost whispering voice. "Room 3, only room available. You can take it, but..." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Lock the door. Don't open it after dark." Jake hesitated for a moment, trying to make sense of the strange warning. He chalked it up to the man's old age or perhaps a local superstition. He had heard worse during his travels. It didn't seem like anything serious, just an odd request from an even odder man. He smiled politely, accepting the key without question. "Thanks," Jake said, trying to keep the conversation going. But the receptionist had already turned his attention back to the desk. No more words were exchanged. Jake shook his head and walked away, feeling the old man's eyes on him as he passed. He made his way down the narrow hallway to room 3, where he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Jake stepped into the small motel room, feeling a mixture of relief and unease. It was exactly what he had expected. A cramped, musty room with peeling wallpaper and outdated furniture. The bed, though a little lumpy, seemed inviting enough. He could already feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at him, his body aching for rest after the long drive. He set down his suitcase and tossed his keys on the small wooden nightstand beside the bed. The room was dimly lit, with only a single lamp casting a weak glow. The air felt thick, damp, and stale, the kind of air that had been trapped inside for years. Jake didn't mind, though. He was tired, and the idea of lying down in a bed, even if it wasn't the cleanest, was enough to make him forget about the oddities of the motel for a while. He walked into the bathroom to wash up, glancing at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He didn't look good, dark circles under his eyes, a stubble that hadn't been shaved for a couple of days, and the weariness of the road visible on his face. He splashed some water on his face and stared at his reflection for a moment longer, almost expecting it to show signs of the fatigue he felt deep inside. When he turned off the tap and dried his face, he caught sight of something strange, a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. But when he turned toward it, nothing was there. Shaking his head, Jake dismissed it. He was tired, that's all. The last few days of driving had taken their toll. He grabbed a clean shirt and changed into it, hoping that it would help him feel more refreshed. As he settled into bed, he pulled the covers up and turned off the lamp, allowing the room to fall into complete darkness. The silence was unnerving. It felt unnatural, like something was lurking just outside the room, watching him. But Jake tried to ignore the growing feeling of unease. He was too tired to be scared, and the comfort of the bed made him close his eyes quickly. The moment his head hit the pillow, he felt his body relax, sinking into the mattress. Sleep came fast, but it didn't last long. It was around midnight when Jake awoke, his mind groggy and unclear. He was still in the same position, but the air felt heavier, thicker, as if something had shifted in the room. He opened his eyes, blinking in the darkness, and listened carefully. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, perhaps the house settling or the wind outside rattling the windows. But then he heard it again, a faint scratching sound, almost like claws dragging across wood. The noise was coming from the walls, from somewhere deep inside the motel. He froze, his heart racing in his chest. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't just the usual creaks and groans of an old building. It felt deliberate, like something was trying to get in. Jake sat up in bed, his eyes straining to adjust to the dark. He stared at the walls, expecting to see something or someone moving behind them, but there was nothing. The scratching continued, growing louder, and then it stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He reached over and turned on the bedside lamp, the light flickering briefly before staying steady. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing out of place. The scratching had stopped, leaving only the soft hum of the old clock on the wall. Jake shook his head, trying to calm his nerves. It was probably just the wind or pipes settling, nothing to worry about. He lay back down and tried to convince himself to sleep, but the silence was now thick and suffocating. Every little noise seemed amplified. His mind raced, playing tricks on him. The bed creaked as he shifted, and the faintest of sounds, a distant tap, 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 echoed from somewhere in the building. Unable to settle, Jake reached for his phone to check the time. It was just past 1 a.m. His eyes went back to the clock on the wall, and for the first time he noticed something odd. The hands of the clock were moving backward. He stared at them in disbelief, wondering if he was imagining it. But no, he wasn't. The second hand was moving in reverse, the minute hand slowly crawling backward, as if time itself was being reversed. His breath caught in his throat, and he quickly looked away, trying to convince himself that it was just a glitch, that he was just too tired. But the feeling of unease crept back, stronger now. Something was wrong with this place. Jake could feel it deep in his bones. Jake finally closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would take over, but it wouldn't come. The noises had started again. First, the scratching, but now there were more sounds. Whispers, faint and indecipherable, drifting through the walls like a breeze. They were too quiet to make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. A low, drawn-out murmur, like voices from the other side. Jake's pulse quickened. He tried to reason with himself. It was an old building, and old buildings made noise. The plumbing, the pipes, the wind, all could cause strange sounds. But this was something different. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, surrounding him like an invisible presence. He pulled the covers tighter around himself, as if it would protect him from whatever was lurking in the dark. His breath came faster as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door, so loud and unexpected that it made Jake jump out of bed, his heart racing. The knocking was slow, deliberate, as though someone was trying to get his attention. His mind raced. Who could it be? There was no one else in the motel, and the old man had warned him to stay inside, to lock the door. The knocking came again, this time accompanied by a scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor just outside his door. Jake's mouth went dry. He didn't know what to do. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for it to burst open. The whispers in the walls seemed to grow louder, as if urging him to answer, to unlock the door. But Jake knew better than to give in. He backed away from the door slowly, his hands still on the handle, as if he could somehow ward off whatever was on the other side. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noises stopped. The room fell silent again, but the silence was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. Jake's heart hammered in his chest, and the air felt thick, charged with something dark and unknown. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible events unfolding around him. Then, a figure appeared in the doorway, a shadow, tall and thin, standing motionless in the hallway. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The figure seemed to be watching him, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And then, without a word, the figure disappeared into the shadows. Jake didn't wait another moment. He rushed to the window, flinging open the blinds, desperate to see anything that could explain what was happening. But the night outside was as dark and empty as ever. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he turned back to the room. What was happening to him? Jake's nerves were on edge, the silence of the room suffocating him. His eyes darted around, half expecting to see the shadowy figure again or hear the strange noises that had been tormenting him. But for now, the room remained still, almost too still. He had always prided himself on being a logical person. He had driven through countless remote areas, stayed in rundown motels before, and had never experienced anything remotely supernatural. So why did this place feel so wrong? Why was he so sure something was watching him? He tried to rationalize it, but the fear creeping into his mind wouldn't let go. He lay back in bed, but sleep seemed elusive now. Every little creak in the walls sent his heart racing. He rolled over, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. As he closed his eyes, his body tensed, and his senses heightened, listening for any disturbance in the night. And then it came again, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragged across wood. But this time it was closer, much closer. Jake's heart pounded as he sat up in bed, the darkness of the room feeling thick, almost suffocating. The sound seemed to come from the corner of the room near the window. His eyes strained in the blackness, desperately searching for any sign of movement. Then, in the faint glow of the streetlight outside, Jake saw it. A shadow. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a wisp of darkness against the corner of the room. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, it became clearer. The figure was standing motionless at the foot of his bed, a silhouette that blended with the shadows. Jake froze, unable to move or speak. The figure was tall and thin, its outline hazy, as though it was made of smoke or mist. For a split second, Jake thought it was his mind playing tricks on him. He had to be hallucinating, right? But then, the figure stepped forward, its movement eerily smooth and soundless. The air grew colder, a chill sweeping across the room, and Jake's breath became visible in the frozen air. The figure's face was obscured by darkness, but its presence felt suffocating. Jake could feel its gaze on him, though he couldn't see its eyes. It was as if it was waiting, watching, assessing. His heart thudded in his chest as he blinked rapidly, hoping that when he opened his eyes again, the figure would be gone. But when he opened them, the figure hadn't moved. It was still there, standing right at the foot of the bed, closer now. Jake's pulse raced, his breathing quickening. This couldn't be real. This had to be a dream, a nightmare born from the exhaustion of the road. But the cold air, the oppressive weight in the room, and the feeling of being trapped in the presence of something not of this world told him otherwise. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the room. Jake gasped, his heart still pounding in his chest. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what had just happened. He couldn't deny it any longer. The motel was haunted. There was something in this place, something he couldn't explain. He pushed himself off the bed, his legs shaky as he stood. His gaze flicked nervously to the door, then to the window, but the room was still empty. Whatever he had seen, it was gone now, but the fear remained. He needed to get out. He couldn't stay here. But as he moved toward the door, the room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in on him as though the motel itself were alive. The strange noises returned, louder now, as if the very building was alive and groaning, shifting around him. The whispers seemed to echo from within the walls, growing clearer, though still unintelligible. A cold sweat broke out on Jake's forehead as he backed away from the door, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do or where he could go. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt like lead. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from somewhere in the motel. A distant thud, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. Jake's body tensed, his heart skipping a beat. He spun around to face the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. The room felt darker now, more oppressive. The air was thick with the sound of the building creaking and groaning, as if it were alive, shifting, and moving. Jake's mind raced with fear. Whatever was in this place, it was not letting him leave. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to figure out what was going on. He couldn't just leave, it wasn't safe. He needed to find out what was happening here, what had happened to the old man behind the desk. The receptionist had warned him to lock the door, to not open it after dark. But why? What had he been trying to protect him from? And then, as Jake's thoughts spiraled, he heard the soft sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer from behind the door. He didn't know whether to turn and face it or run. His instincts screamed for him to flee, but something deep inside told him to stay. He gritted his teeth and took another step toward the door, his hand hovering just above the handle. Then, without warning, the knocking began again. The slow, rhythmic knocking that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls. The hairs on the back of Jake's neck stood on end as the scratching returned, louder this time. It was almost as if something was trying to claw its way into the room. "Please," Jake whispered under his breath, praying that whatever was behind that door would just go away. But he knew deep down that it wouldn't. The morning sun barely managed to pierce through the heavy curtains of room 3, casting weak, dusty beams of light across the worn-out carpet. Jake jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, the memory of the shadowy figure still vivid in his mind. For a moment, he thought it had all been a terrible dream, until he noticed the frost still lingering on the inside of the window and the deep claw marks scratched into the wooden nightstand beside his bed. His heart raced as he sat up, wiping sweat from his brow. The room felt heavier in the daylight, thick with an oppressive silence. Jake tried to shake off the fear that clung to him, telling himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But the unsettling feeling lingered. He stepped into the cold, narrow hallway, its walls covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges like skin coming off a wound. A musty odor hung in the air, mixed with the faint metallic scent he hadn't noticed the night before. As he made his way toward the front desk, the entire motel seemed eerily lifeless, too quiet for a place meant to host travelers. The lobby was empty. The front desk, where the old receptionist had sat the night before, was abandoned. The ledger was gone, leaving behind only a faint dust outline of where it had rested. Jake tapped the service bell once. Its hollow ring echoed too long in the vacant room. No one answered. Unease twisted in his gut, but curiosity pulled him deeper. He wandered the hallways, his shoes creaking against warped wooden floors. It was then he noticed the faded photographs hanging on the walls. Old black and white images of past guests, some smiling stiffly, others with hollow eyes. But something was deeply wrong. Every single face had been scratched out with deep, angry gouges, as though someone had violently tried to erase their existence. Jake stopped at one photo that hadn't been defaced. It was of the old receptionist, the same man who had handed him the key, but in this picture, he looked much younger and terrified, as though he were caught mid-scream. Jake felt a cold wave run down his spine. How old was this picture? It seemed like decades had passed since it was taken. Continuing down the hallway, he found doors to other rooms, but they wouldn't budge. The handles rattled, locked tight, and through the dusty windows, he could see that the rooms were empty, their furniture broken and scattered as if no one had stayed there for years. At the end of the hallway, he found an old vending machine. Ancient, its glass cracked, filled with snacks that had long since expired. Above it, another strange detail caught his eye. A faded evacuation map pinned to the wall. But the map didn't make sense. It showed the layout of the motel, but the corridors twisted impossibly, with rooms placed at odd angles, some even overlapping. Scribbled in red ink across it was one word: trapped. Jake's pulse quickened. He turned, suddenly hyper-aware of how empty the motel felt. The walls seemed closer than before, the air denser, heavier. The faint sound of static buzzed through the hallway, like a broken radio struggling to catch a signal. Determined to clear his head, Jake decided to step outside for fresh air. He pushed open the front door, expecting to see the highway where he had parked his car the night before. But instead, there was nothing, just a thick, gray fog swallowing everything. The road was gone. His car was gone. The only thing in sight was the outline of the motel, standing alone in a world of mist. Jake stumbled backward in shock, slamming the door shut behind him. His breathing came fast and shallow now. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "It's gotta be a nightmare." But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The motel wasn't just a rundown pit stop. It was something else. Something that didn't want him to leave. As Jake made his way back to his room, the old clock on the wall ticked louder than before. It was only then that he noticed. The time hadn't moved since he arrived. It was stuck at exactly 12:13 a.m., the moment he'd first seen the shadow at the edge of his bed. He swallowed hard, dread curling in his stomach. This wasn't just a haunted motel. It was a trap, and now it had him. Jake's mind raced as he stormed back into the lobby, his footsteps heavy against the warped wooden floor. The silence felt louder now, as though the walls themselves were waiting, listening. He needed answers, and the only person who might have them was the old receptionist. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice cracking in the heavy air. "I need to talk to you." No response. He stepped behind the front desk, where a dusty register sat closed. There was a faint draft, cool and sharp, seeping from a crack in the wooden floor beneath the desk. Jake crouched down and noticed something strange. A thin seam outlining what looked like a hidden trapdoor. Before he could investigate further, a distant voice echoed through the empty motel, hollow and strained. "You shouldn't be here." Jake spun around. The voice was unmistakably the old man's, but it didn't sound like it was coming from within the motel. It was deeper, as if buried underground. "Where are you?" Jake shouted, panic rising in his throat. No reply. He raced through the motel, checking every door, every hallway, but the receptionist was gone. His office was empty, papers scattered across the floor, a single teacup left untouched on the desk. The faint smell of tobacco still lingered, but there was no sign of the man himself. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Jake's heart hammered as he returned to the front desk and knelt by the trapdoor. With trembling fingers, he wedged his car keys into the seam and pried it open. Dust swirled upward as the heavy wood creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the depths below. Against his better judgment, Jake grabbed the flashlight from his bag and descended. The stairs led to a cold, damp basement, the walls lined with crumbling brick and decaying wooden beams. A faint flicker of light glowed deeper within, drawing him forward. Jake followed the faint illumination until he reached a small, cavernous room. It was filled with rows of old filing cabinets, their metal sides rusted and warped. Tacked to the far wall was a massive corkboard, covered in yellowed photographs and torn documents. He stepped closer and felt his blood run cold. The photos were of people, dozens of them. Some looked modern, others were clearly decades old. But all the faces were the same as those scratched-out portraits he'd seen upstairs. Underneath each picture was a date, and a single word: missing. Jake's hands trembled as he flipped through the documents scattered across a dusty table. Police reports, newspaper clippings, missing person flyers, all tied to the motel. The earliest report dated back to the 1950s. Then he found it. An old newspaper clipping with the headline, "Local motel linked to series of disappearances. Authorities baffled." The photo beneath the headline showed the very same motel, but in pristine condition with fresh paint and a newly lit neon sign. Standing in front of it was the same old receptionist, only decades younger. But what made Jake's stomach twist was the look on the man's face. Not the calm, stern expression Jake had seen the night before, but sheer terror, as if he was being forced into the picture. A cold breeze drifted through the basement, carrying a whisper. "It's always hungry." Jake whipped around, his flashlight flickering. In the shadows, he saw movement, something slithering just out of sight, too large to be a person. The walls of the basement groaned, the wooden beams bending as though under immense pressure. He bolted up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut behind him, chest heaving with panic. But when he looked around, the motel was different. The hallways had shifted, doors had moved. The wallpaper peeled away to reveal decaying, blackened wood, and the air was thick with a metallic stench. The motel was alive now, responding to his presence. Jake realized the horrible truth. The receptionist hadn't vanished. He'd been swallowed, and Jake was next. Jake's breath was shallow, and his heart thudded in his chest as he sprinted through the shifting hallways. Every corner seemed to lead him in circles, the same worn carpet beneath his feet, the same peeling wallpaper, but something felt wrong. Something was out of place. The very structure of the motel seemed to be alive, reacting to his every move. He skidded to a stop in front of a door that hadn't been there earlier. It was dark, weathered, and covered in thick, ancient cobwebs. His mind screamed for him to turn back, but curiosity overpowered his fear. With shaking hands, Jake grasped the cold handle, his fingers slipping slightly on the rusted surface. It creaked open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, and Jake shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn forward, compelled to continue. At the end of the hallway, he found a heavy wooden door. It was slightly ajar, as though someone had left it in a hurry. Jake pushed it open cautiously, holding his breath as he stepped inside. The room was unlike any he'd seen before. It was small and cramped, filled with old furniture draped in dusty sheets. The air was thick with mildew, and the floorboards creaked under Jake's weight as he slowly made his way deeper into the room. His flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. What caught his eye, though, were the walls themselves. They were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Old black and white pictures of families, couples, and individuals, all smiling in front of the very same motel. But Jake's stomach twisted as he realized something unsettling. The faces in every single photo were scratched out, erased, as if someone was desperately trying to hide their identities. He walked closer, his pulse quickening. Among the photos, one in particular caught his attention. A man standing alone in front of the motel. He was old, gaunt, and his eyes were wide with terror. His face was unmistakable. It was the receptionist. But in the photograph, he looked completely different. Frightened, haunted, as if he was in some kind of distress. Jake's heart raced as he continued to examine the images, finding something more disturbing with each photo. One photograph, in particular, had the words "Never Escape" written in red ink across the bottom. As Jake reached to touch the photo, the temperature in the room plummeted even further. He could see his breath in the cold air. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, dark shapes moving in the periphery of his vision. He swung the flashlight around, but nothing was there. His breath caught in his throat as he turned to leave the room, but something stopped him. An unmistakable sound. Faint whisper. "You shouldn't have come." Jake whipped around, but the room was empty, still as a tomb. His heart pounded in his chest, and a surge of panic rushed through him. What the hell was happening? Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Jake leaped back, his pulse pounding in his ears. He tried to force the door open, but it was as though the walls were pressing in on him. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to distort, like a funhouse mirror warping reality. In the corner of the room, a dark figure began to emerge from the shadows. Its features were indistinguishable, its shape towering and misshapen. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. He couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly, a hollow void that seemed to draw him in. And then it spoke, its voice a rasping, low growl. "You are ours now." Jake staggered back, panic surging through him. He had to escape. He didn't know how, but he had to. As he struggled to force the door open, the figure lunged toward him, its shadowy hands reaching for him. He barely managed to push the door open and stumble out into the hallway, but the motel was no longer the same. The walls shifted around him, and the very structure of the building seemed to bend and twist, as if it was alive. He turned and ran, his breath ragged, his heart beating wildly in his chest. The motel was changing, becoming something darker, something more sinister. The windows had vanished, and the walls seemed to move closer, trapping him in a nightmare. The hallway stretched impossibly long, and the familiar doorways turned into narrow, claustrophobic corridors. The building was swallowing him whole. Jake's mind raced as he tried to find an exit, but no matter which way he turned, he found himself back where he started. The motel was feeding off his fear, growing more powerful with each passing second. It was as if the very foundation of the place had a life of its own, and it didn't want to let him leave. In a desperate attempt, Jake tried to break through one of the walls, but his hands bled from the effort. His body was trembling with exhaustion and fear, and he felt his sanity slipping away. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open, and the walls began to collapse, drawing him toward a black, gaping abyss. Jake screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. Jake's heart raced, his breath shallow and panicked as he stumbled through the never-ending maze of the motel's warped hallways. His legs were weak, and every step felt like an eternity as the walls seemed to press in on him. The shadows around him swirled and flickered, distorting into shapes that didn't belong. The motel itself was alive with malice, pulling him deeper into its sinister web. The air had grown thick and stifling, a heavy mist creeping in from all sides, making it harder for Jake to see, to breathe. He reached out, desperate for something solid, but his hands grazed only cold, damp walls that seemed to move as he touched them. And then the laughter started. It wasn't the laugh of a person, but something far more insidious. A low, guttural cackle that echoed throughout the entire building. It sent chills down Jake's spine, the hairs on his neck standing on end. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Suddenly, the voice of the old man, the receptionist, boomed through the walls, so loud it seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath Jake's feet. "Once you're here, you're never leaving." The words sent a shockwave of fear through Jake. He wasn't sure how, but he knew that the old man's voice wasn't just an echo. It was alive, just like the motel itself. It was part of the nightmare that was consuming him, a malevolent force that thrived on the souls of its guests. Panic seized Jake's chest, and he stumbled backwards, tripping over his own feet as the laughter intensified. He turned in every direction, but the shadows around him grew longer, the figures moving closer. He saw dark, formless shapes closing in on him from all sides, their hands reaching out, their faces twisted in grotesque mockeries of humanity. Jake's heart pounded in his ears, the world around him spinning. He tried to run, but it felt as though the very walls were pushing him back, making each step heavier, more futile. The motel was closing in on him, trapping him in its claustrophobic grip. And then, from the darkness ahead, Jake saw it, an ominous figure towering over him. The silhouette of a man, his face hidden in shadow, but Jake could feel its presence. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and Jake froze, his body shaking uncontrollably. "You cannot escape." The voice was distorted, filled with static, like it came from deep within the earth. It echoed in Jake's mind, rattling his thoughts, making his head spin. Jake's survival instinct kicked in. He had to get out. But where? The motel was alive, and it wasn't going to let him leave. The figure took another step, its shadow engulfing Jake. The temperature plummeted, and Jake's breath formed clouds in the icy air. The walls seemed to pulse, contracting and expanding, as though they were breathing, waiting for him to make his final move. In that moment, Jake realized something terrible. He was not alone in this place. The shadows were not just figments of his fear. They were the souls of the people who had come before him, trapped by the motel, consumed by its hunger. They were reaching out, dragging him closer, pulling him into the same fate. But Jake couldn't give up. He couldn't let the motel win. In a blind rush of adrenaline, Jake shoved past the shadowy figure, his hands scraping against the cold walls as he ran blindly through the winding hallways. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get out, he had to escape. The laughter intensified as he ran, the walls shaking as if in anger, and the very foundation of the motel groaned under the weight of his struggle. It was clear now that the motel was changing, shifting its very shape, molding itself to trap him, to consume him. It had taken so many before him. It wasn't going to let him leave, not alive. But Jake wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. Suddenly, he caught sight of something, a flicker of light in the distance. Hope surged in his chest as he stumbled toward it. Was this the exit? Was this his way out? Jake pushed forward, his legs screaming in pain, his body refusing to cooperate. He couldn't stop now. He reached the source of the light and found himself standing before a window. It was small and narrow, barely big enough for him to fit through, but it was his only chance. The glass was old and cracked, but it was still solid. Jake slammed his fist into the glass, shattering it. The cold night air rushed in, sharp and biting against his skin. He didn't hesitate. He crawled through the jagged opening. His hands and arms scraped raw, but he didn't feel it. He didn't care. All that mattered was getting out. His feet hit the ground outside, the cool earth beneath him a welcome relief after the oppressive heat of the motel. He took a deep breath, but the air felt thick, the fog swirling around him as if it didn't want to let him go. For a moment, Jake thought he had made it. He was free. He had escaped. But then he heard it. The laughter, the haunting, familiar laughter. And when he turned around, he saw the motel. It was gone. There was no sign of the old building, no trace of the nightmare that had held him captive. Only an empty stretch of road, illuminated by the pale moonlight. The fog had lifted, and the night air was quiet. Jake's mind spun. He couldn't comprehend it. Where had the motel gone? Had it ever existed at all? But when he checked his phone, everything fell into place. In the last video he had recorded, the motel was never there. The footage showed only an empty road stretching out before him, and Jake walking alone, the very same stretch of highway he had passed earlier. There were no traces of the old man, no sign of the sinister motel. Had it all been a hallucination? Or had something far worse happened to him? Something that couldn't be explained? As he stood there, trembling in the darkness, Jake realized one chilling truth. He had never left the motel, and he never would. Jake stood frozen, staring at his phone screen in disbelief. The video he had just watched was not the one he had intended to record. It didn't show the nightmare he had endured inside the cursed motel. There were no shadows, no eerie figures. Only Jake himself walking along an empty, desolate stretch of road, the same one he had been traveling before entering the motel. The building was gone. No trace of it remained. He felt dizzy, his stomach churning. What was happening? Was the entire thing just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear? But the memories felt too vivid. The laughter, the shadows, the shifting walls. His heart pounded in his chest as a gnawing feeling of unease crawled up his spine. Was he still in the motel? He blinked, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but the realization hit him hard. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, but behind him, there was nothing. No lights from the motel, no old man, no creeping fog. The sensation of being watched, however, hadn't gone away. He turned his head, scanning the area around him. The darkness of the night felt deeper, more suffocating, as though the shadows themselves were alive, watching, waiting. He felt a prickling on the back of his neck. Desperation clawed at him. He had to get away. Whatever was happening, he had to get far from the nightmare that had almost consumed him. Jake turned to face the road again, taking a few tentative steps forward. As he did, he heard a faint sound from behind him. It was barely audible, like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. "Jake!" He froze, his breath hitched in his throat. It was the old man's voice. How could it be? The voice echoed again, low and menacing. "Jake, you're never leaving." His pulse quickened. It felt like the ground beneath his feet was shifting again, pulling him back. The road itself seemed to stretch longer, twisting into an endless void that threatened to swallow him whole. Jake couldn't bear it. He needed to escape. His eyes darted to the left, where a small, dilapidated building stood in the distance. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to call to him, its dark silhouette framed by the ghostly glow of the moon. Without thinking, he broke into a sprint. The heavy fog parted in front of him as he raced toward the building, each step faster than the last. The sound of footsteps behind him quickened, matching his pace. He dared not look back. He didn't want to see what might be chasing him. As he approached the building, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, a faint, rusty light coming from within. Without hesitation, Jake shoved the door open and stepped inside. The air in the room was stale, musty with the smell of old wood and mildew. It was a small, claustrophobic space, but Jake didn't care. The room was devoid of any furniture or decorations, save for a pile of old, rotting floorboards in the corner. He stepped forward, his footfall echoing loudly in the silence, his heartbeat deafening in his ears. Then he saw it. A small rusted key lay on the floor, half buried beneath the debris. It was old, too old, but Jake couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that it was meant for him. His hand shook as he reached for it, his fingers closing around the cold metal. The moment his hand touched the key, a jolt of electricity shot through his arm, causing him to gasp and stumble backward. The floor beneath him cracked as if the very building had come alive, trembling in response to his touch. "It's too late," a voice whispered from the shadows. Jake turned, his heart hammering. The key in his hand pulsed with an otherworldly energy, its metal surface gleaming under the flickering light. The floor trembled again, and Jake felt the walls close in around him. The air grew thick, suffocating. The motel, the nightmare, was still with him, and it wasn't about to let him go. He needed to get out. Frantically, he ran toward the back door, but as he passed by the broken windows, he saw something that froze him in place. Outside, the fog had thickened once again, and shadows moved within it, shifting unnaturally. His body screamed for him to turn back, but Jake clenched his teeth and shoved the door open. The moment he stepped outside, he felt a cold, creeping hand clasp around his ankle, pulling him back toward the door. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. But as he struggled, he noticed something strange. The motel, the building itself, was shifting. The windows began to fade, the walls collapsing and reshaping into something monstrous. He could hear the low groans of the structure as if it was alive, twisting its form to trap him once more. And that was when he realized the horrifying truth. There was no escape. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he kicked wildly at the cold, unseen grip tightening around his ankle. Every desperate jerk sent sharp jolts of pain up his leg, but he didn't stop. His fingers clenched the rusted key, its jagged edges digging into his palm, grounding him in the moment. With one final, violent kick, he broke free. Jake scrambled to his feet, the fog swirling around him like living shadows, whispering things he didn't dare understand. The motel loomed behind him, no longer the rundown structure he'd first seen. It had grown taller, warped, its windows gaping open like empty eyes. The flickering neon sign now read "No Escape" in jagged, blood-red letters. He didn't look back again. Jake bolted into the darkness, feet pounding against the cold, cracked asphalt. The oppressive fog thinned as he ran, and for the first time in hours, maybe longer, he saw the faint outline of a road ahead. His chest burned, breath ragged, but he didn't stop. The air grew clearer, the suffocating heaviness lifting, until silence. Jake skidded to a stop on the side of the empty highway. He bent over, gasping for breath, his heart still racing. When he finally dared to turn around, his blood ran cold. The motel was gone. No crumbling sign, no broken windows, no creeping fog. The entire structure had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the long, deserted stretch of road beneath a pale, cloudless sky. Jake stood there, stunned, his mind struggling to process the emptiness before him. Did I imagine it all? But the rusted key still sat heavy in his hand, solid, cold, real. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Jake yanked it out with trembling fingers. There was a new notification. One video saved. His heart sank. Hesitating for only a moment, he tapped the screen. The last video he'd recorded at the motel flickered to life. But it wasn't what he expected. Instead of footage of the cursed motel, the screen showed him, alone, walking along the dark road, talking to himself. There were no shadows, no fog, no neon sign, no motel. He watched as the video showed him stopping in the middle of the road, looking around, then talking to someone or something that wasn't there. His voice, distorted on the recording, echoed through the phone. I see it now. The motel. It's right here. But on the screen, there was only empty space. Jake's breath hitched. He fast-forwarded the video. At the very end, the camera caught him standing still, wide-eyed, before collapsing to his knees. And then, just before the screen went dark, a single, chilling whisper came through the audio. You never left. The video ended. Jake's hands shook uncontrollably as he closed the app. His mind was a storm of questions, but deep down he knew the truth. That motel? It hadn't been a place. It had been a trap. A cursed, living entity feeding off lost souls. And somehow he'd gotten away. At least that's what he hoped. The key in his hand grew colder, its edges sharper. Jake threw it as far as he could into the woods, not waiting to hear it land. He started the car, tires screeching against the pavement as he sped away from that stretch of road. But as he drove, something gnawed at his thoughts, a feeling that burrowed deep. In the rearview mirror, for the briefest moment, he thought he saw the flickering glow of a neon sign. Vacancy. Then it vanished. Jake didn't stop driving until the eerie emptiness of the dark highway gave way to the faint glow of a nearby town. Streetlights flickered overhead, neon signs buzzed from late-night diners, and life, ordinary life, resumed around him. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He pulled into a gas station, his hands still trembling as he filled the tank. The fluorescent lights above buzzed harshly, washing everything in an unnatural glow. He couldn't help but glance into the surrounding darkness, half expecting the motel's warped shape to emerge from the shadows. Inside the station, Jake grabbed a cup of black coffee and approached the clerk, a young guy in his 20s scrolling on his phone. "Hey," Jake started, his voice rough. "That stretch of highway about 20 miles back. Was there ever a motel there?" The clerk barely looked up. "Motel? Out there? No way, man. Nothing but empty road and cornfields." Jake's throat tightened. "You sure? Old place, maybe? Looked abandoned." The clerk finally made eye contact, a shadow of discomfort passing over his face. "Nah, but you're not the first one to ask that." Jake's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" The guy hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Couple years back, some folks talked about a place out there. Weird stuff. People claiming they saw lights, a building that wasn't there before. One guy swore he spent a night in a motel that vanished by morning." He chuckled nervously. "Most folks figure it's just stories. Urban legends." Jake's hands clenched around the coffee cup. "Yeah," Jake muttered. "Urban legends." But he couldn't stop thinking about the key, the cold metal in his hand, and the video on his phone. He left the gas station and checked into a nearby hotel, one bustling with life, voices, and the reassuring sounds of normalcy. But sleep didn't come easy. When he finally drifted off, the same nightmare returned. Dark corridors, shifting walls, the flickering neon sign reading "No escape," and that low, hollow voice repeating, "You never left." Jake jolted awake, drenched in sweat. Grabbing his phone, he went to delete the video, but it was gone. No trace of it in his gallery, no saved files. It was as if it had never existed. But the real terror came when he noticed something else. His GPS history. It still marked his last location as Hollow Creek Motel. The problem was, there was no such place. Weeks passed. Jake tried to return to his routine, but the events of that night clawed at the edges of his sanity. He researched late into the nights, digging through local legends, newspaper archives, and urban myths. There were scattered accounts, strange disappearances, unexplained sightings on the same stretch of highway, but nothing concrete. Until he found it. An old newspaper clipping from the 1970s. Tragedy strikes local motel. Fire claims 6 lives at Hollow Creek Motel. Jake's blood ran cold. The article detailed how the motel had burned down after a fire sparked in the basement, trapping guests inside. The owner, an elderly man described as reclusive and strange, was the only one found outside the building when authorities arrived. He later disappeared before the investigation concluded. Jake stared at the yellowed page, his hands clammy. The motel wasn't just haunted. It was cursed, a remnant of the past still clinging to the present, luring in anyone unfortunate enough to cross its path. Later that evening, Jake took a long drive, needing to clear his head. The radio played softly, a calm contrast to the chaos swirling in his mind. Then, without warning, static filled the speakers. The song cut out. Through the distortion, a familiar voice broke through. "You forgot something, Jake." His grip on the steering wheel tightened as the radio fell silent. Up ahead, in the rearview mirror, for the briefest second, the flickering glow of the neon sign appeared again. Vacancy. Jake didn't look back, but deep down he knew the truth. The motel wasn't done with him yet. If this story sent chills down your spine, there are even darker tales waiting for you. Subscribe to Horror Horizon and step deeper into the shadows. But remember, not every story has an escape.